So today we have another rogue build for you all. A lot of you wanted to see my take on the Flurry build. Once again, this is a leveling build, which means that we're going from 1 to 50. And this also means that we're only using the Codex of Power legendaries, which are guaranteed legendaries that you can get from the dungeons. With that being said, there's a few things that I consider when talking about leveling builds. The first thing is I tend to steer towards single target damage because that's usually what causes your sort of pain in terms of clearing dungeons or clearing campaign, etc. And also mobility, which of course will be alleviated once we get that mount around Act 2, Act 3-ish. With that being said, let's dive into the skills. So I like to call this rogue build the Rogue Imbue build just because we are using two separate type of imbuements. We're going to be using Puncture, Flurry, Poison Imbuement, Shadow Imbuement, Shadow Clone, and Shadow Step. This is a really solid kind of combination of AoE and single target damage, especially with the Poison Imbuement buffs. This is very powerful, and in fact, the Poison Imbuement itself actually ends up being a little bit of AoE and works extremely well with the Shadow Imbuement. Now, let's dive into the skill tree and talk about this. By the way, for any of you that are just wanting the information, I have a link to this shared build as well as the Google spreadsheets that I'm working on for all the different builds for us to showcase in the videos. Now, we have the basic here, Puncture. We're going to put 2 points into Puncture. The reason why we're using Puncture and the reason I love Puncture, especially on melee builds, is Fundamental Puncture. This throws 3 blades, and if we hit with 2 of them on a target, we're going to make them vulnerable, which gives us basically permanent vulnerability within melee range. Again, we have to hit with 2 blades, so as long as we're at that mid-range, it's going to be super powerful. So 2 points into the Puncture, and then Enhanced Puncture, come down to pick up Flurry, and then come back up to pick up Fundamental Puncture. Then we're going to basically go Enhanced Flurry into Improved Flurry. Improved Flurry with Puncture, really powerful, because what this does is if we hit with a vulnerable enemy, or if we hit a vulnerable enemy, we're going to make all enemies hit by that cast vulnerable for 3 seconds. Now, Advanced Flurry gives us a little bit of stunning, but to be honest, this isn't nearly as valuable as just AoE flurrying. Again, Puncture is really solid to kind of give vulnerable whenever we need it, but AoE vulnerable is kind of hard with Fundamental Puncture, so this is super powerful for a lot of different things that we're going to be using later on in the build. On top of that, we have the Enhanced Flurry, which is going to give us a ton of healing whenever we hit a vulnerable enemy. So this is very good for sustain, and really helps us out in the later levels when we start to approach that level 50, because early on we don't need a ton of survivability, but if you're running a melee build and a melee build where you don't have a ton of movement, right? Unlike Twisting Blades where you're hitting something, moving to the side, trying to get those cooldowns refreshed, this build really sits into the fight and tries to heal or out sustain, and this is super powerful with AoE vulnerability. So we're going to pick up those 2, and then we're going to put 1 point into Flurry, and then pick up Shadow Step and Dash. Now, once again, if you guys watched my previous video, we're picking up Shadow Step and Dash so that we can go ahead and have the mobility in the early game. We're going to be taking off Dash in this build rather than Shadow Step, because Shadow Step actually gives us Unstoppable. We're going to be taking off Dash when we get access to our ultimate later on in the build. So picking up both these for movement early on, and then once we get our mount, we don't need them as much, so we're going to go ahead and drop one of them in Dash this case, come back up, finish off Flurry. Then we're going to go immediately into Exploit, which is down here for additional damage against healthy and injured enemies. Very big damage increase, very powerful. A lot of passives on the rogue are extremely good at ramping up your damage, and Exploit is no different. Then we're going to pick up 1 point into Weapon Mastery. Important note about this, I much prefer swords. This is going to give us consistent increased damage over daggers. Okay, so swords is a very nice addition. Then we're going to come down here and pick up Poison and then Shadow Imbuement. Now, this is where the combos start to really start to fill out. After we pick up Shadow and Poison Imbuement, we're going to go for Enhanced Poison Imbuement and then Blended Poison Imbuement. This is very crucial. Blended poison imbuement. Critical strikes is going to make us do additional increased poisoning damage with our imbued skills, which is very, very powerful, right? But get this. With enhanced shadow imbuement, we have 15% increased critical strike chance against injured enemies infected by shadow imbuement, and we're going to get increased non-physical damage, which includes poisoning damage for 8 seconds when they're shadow imbued. So very, very important to note, we actually want to shadow imbue first, then poison imbue, so we can get those bonuses, okay? So whenever we're using these skills, shadow imbuement first, then poison imbuement, so that way you can apply those infected and then go ahead and poison them with the poison skill. Okay, very, very powerful. After that, we're going to come back up for weapon mastery finish off, so some extra percentage damage. Then we're going to go ahead and finally take our shadow clone. We're going to come back up and pick up sturdy 1 point for some damage reduction, then pick up shadow clone and actually take a detour over to innervation. Now, innervation is arguably the key passive in this build to make sure we have a very, very solid regeneration of our energy. If you did not know, each one of these skills has a separate lucky hit chance, and you can see here, like for example, Flurry has 10%, but then also the poisoning damage, the infected damage, etc. has a lucky hit chance of its own, which makes it super, super powerful, right? That means that we get a lot of chances for lucky hits, and that means that we're gonna get a lot of energy regeneration, okay? So we pick up innervation, then we max out Prime and Supreme Shadow Clone, giving us another Unstoppable in conjunction with the Shadow Step and a little bit of extra damage on our ultimate. Shadow Clone is just so good at bursting down bosses in those scenarios. 80% essentially additional damage from our Flurry is huge. Then we pick up the Precision Imbuement, which is going to work really well with our double imbuement skills, and another thing later on is going to work really well with the imbuement skills. Then we have Siphoning Strikes. Now, I really like Siphoning Strikes in the melee Flurry build. Unlike the Twisting Blades, as I mentioned earlier, we're not going to be jumping around as much, so staying close, critically striking enemies, which we will be doing more often because of our Precision Imbuement, we're going to get some more healing out of our build, and it's going to work out really, really well. Malice is the next one up. We're actually going to go 1 point into Malice, and then we're going to drop down here for our key passive, Close Quarters Combat. Now, you can run Momentum, and someone actually mentioned this on a previous video, which is a great suggestion. Momentum is good. The only problem is some bosses you'll be able to attack from behind, or some situations you might be able to stun, and some you won't. So me personally, I prefer just to go to the guaranteed value from the Close Quarters Combat, because you're always going to be close with your Flurry, and that also means that you're just going to get the extra attack speed and potentially extra damage, right? On top of that, after we get that, we're going to finish off Malice here, then head over to Poison Imbuement and max it out. I'm much more concerned over the single target damage. When we have AoE Flurry, AoE Shadow Imbuement, we need a little bit more single target damage. Then we pick up 1 point Deadly Venom, 1 point Alchemical Advantage for additional poisoning damage and attack speed when we poison enemies, and lastly, 3 points Debilitating Toxins. Now, there's a debate between Debilitating Toxins and the Sturdy over here with close damage reduction. To me, if you're going to be close to an enemy, you're going to be poisoning them, which means 15% is greater than the 12% that you potentially get from Sturdy. On top of that, poisoning works if they move away from you, which is really, really strong, and will potentially last a little bit longer, right? Because, well, you're not always close to your opponent in general, even if you are meleeing them down. So that's going to be the skills. I do want to mention really quickly that there are a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different ways you can build this build. This is just my take on it. And I think that this is one of the strongest versions that I've experienced, especially with our legendary items, which we have to go over next. So diving into the legendary items here, we can obviously replace every single piece of gear and weapon with a legendary item, and that would be better. But I want to focus on obviously the ones we can only get from Codex of Power and the slots that you don't want to replace all the time. Again, this is a leveling focused build, so I don't want you to like put a legendary aspect on your weapon and then have to replace it in like 2 levels when you get an upgraded weapon. So with that said, let's go over the most important one for this build, and that's Aspect of Encircling Blades here. This one allows our Flurry to basically AoE in a circle around us and do increased damage. This is huge, okay? This allows our Flurry to be, again, rather than a conal AoE attack, it is a 360-degree attack everywhere around us. This changes your boss clearing, or rather your dungeon clearing, very, very, very insanely a lot because of the AoE that you're adding in with this aspect. The second one that I want to go over is Edge Master's aspect. Now, we are running Edge Master's aspect on the two-handed weapon, and it's the bow because we're not going to be replacing it. But more importantly, this just does a ton of extra damage. And when we're coming into this battle, we usually are going to be imbuing and then casting our skill, and we're just going to get a ton of extra damage out of that, which is really, really useful. In addition to our energy regeneration from Innervation, this should be topped off quite regularly. And with our specialization, this should work really, really well as well. Next two, and these ones might be a little bit, I guess you could say, not used to, because you've probably haven't seen them since really they're very specific. First one is going to be Aspect of Corruption. Aspect of Corruption is going to give you a massive value in your imbuement skill if you hit vulnerable enemies, and with Aspect of Encircling Blades plus Fundamental Puncture plus the I believe it's called the Enhanced or Improved Flurry, this one right here, where you're going to get the, I guess it's Improved Flurry, where you're going to get the vulnerable, anytime you hit a vulnerable enemy, guess what? You have an AoE vulnerable application plus the Shadow Imbuement plus the Poison Imbuement on an AoE. This is really, really nice in combination with those skills. And lastly, we have Aspect of Unstable Imbuements. This allows you to basically get an additional proc of damage whenever we cast an imbuement skill on ourselves. So we're going to get value out of that AoE Shadow Imbuement, we're going to get value out of that Poison Imbuement, and overall we're just going to get a little bit of additional value off of our skills that we're already wanting to cast. As for specializations, I want to tackle Preparation first. Preparation can be decent in this build because we will reset the cooldown of Poison and Shadow Imbuement with this, and those are our two combo pieces with Flurry. However, I think that the other two generally are going to be way better, and I want to talk about both of them because I wanted to mention this in the previous video, and you guys brought up a lot of great points in the comment section and a lot of considerations, which is one, combo points is generally going to be a little bit better for the wave content or the dungeon clearing content, because you're going to be basicing, and in between those you're going to be casting your flurries, and you're not going to be flurrying all the time because Inner Sight pops and marks a target randomly. So if you're in an AoE or a group of monsters, you can just pop to a random monster outside of your range and then pop to another one after you kill it, and you could very, very likely never fill up your Inner Sight gauge unless it's a single target like a boss. So combo points during the general clearing and then swapping to Inner Sight when you get to the boss is going to be really, really nice, especially for that boss, because again, Edge Master's aspect gives us the maximum damage increase when we have that Inner Sight on, because we have maximum resource. This is going to be very, very big for us to burst down bosses. Combo points is generally going to be just good for, you know, clearing trash, clearing elites, because you can build up those combo points and then launch a massive flurry in addition to applying vulnerable to everyone. Okay, that's gonna be the specializations. Let's go over a few stats. Now we could dive super deep into all of these stats, and there's so many that are good for this build, but I want to talk about a couple ones. First off, damage with core skills, we have Flurry. That's going to be our main damage skill. Now, I will say that you can actually run also damage with Imbued, because we actually have a lot of our damage coming out with Poison Imbuement as well, which could help a ton. Then we have damage versus close, because we're generally going to be close to our opponents when we're launching our Flurry attacks. And lastly, vulnerable damage, because we're going to be constantly applying vulnerable in an AoE fashion. Obviously, damage, critical strike chance, critical strike damage, all this other stuff is very, very good still, but those are particularly good for this build. Hopefully that helps, guys. I have a bunch of more builds coming. I know I did another rogue build today, but I'm going to be doing at least one build for each class, at least from what I experienced during each of the betas and maxing them out, as well as just expanding that to level 50. Rogue is the one that I had the most fun with, and a lot of you asked for the Flurry version, or a Flurry version of the melee rogue. That my take is, or at least my take on it. So hopefully that satisfies those people. Thanks for watching, everyone. Of course, if you enjoyed the video, like the video. If you wanted to stay around for more Diablo 4 content, sub, and I'll see you all for the next one.